Hi, I'm Robert Bauer, the grazing broker for Southwest Badger, RCND, in Dodgeville, Wisconsin. In part 2 of how to use a grazing stick, I'd like to show you how to construct a grazing wedge, which is a tool for producers to determine whether their pastures are regrowing adequately to achieve their desired pre- and post-grazing heights within a managed rotational grazing system. Pasture height is so important for two reasons. Number one, animal intake is fastest when the pastures are between 4 and 12 inches tall. Animals should be taking about 60 to 80 bites per minute, and their forage mass is greatest when the pastures are between those heights. The second reason is that the amount of height predicts leaf area that's available to feed those plants so they can regrow vigorously. In this video, I wanted to show you 3 scenarios that you might encounter with the grazing wedge. The first scenario is when you have adequate pasture regrowth, which we might expect maybe in late spring or in fall when the pastures were regrowing vigorously. The second scenario would be when we have inadequate pasture regrowth, like we might encounter in midsummer. The third scenario would be when we have too much pasture growth, like we might encounter in spring. And I'll discuss how those scenarios will appear on the grazing wedge and how the grazing wedge will inform our management decisions. A grazing wedge is created with measurements that we would take with our grazing stick, or we could use a ruler. Then we would take records, potentially with our record-keeping book that would come with the grazing stick, or we could just use a clipboard and a sheet of paper and walk and measure the height in every paddock. And we would do this measurement about every 2 weeks. To create the grazing wedge using the Southwest Badger method involves 2 steps. In the first step, we simply plot the pasture height sequentially from paddock 1 through however many we have. And then we're going to transpose the data from this graph into our second graph, where we order the paddocks based on the height sequentially from tallest to shortest. And then we'll fill in the paddock numbers based on those paddock heights. Now we've pre-marked a trough where we have the 10 to 12 pre-inch grazing height and then the 4 to 6 post-grazing height. And so our paddocks, if they are regrowing adequately, should fall in a line from between 4 to 6 and 10 to 12. Now if you're grazing another pasture species like bluegrass, in some cases we say that you might start grazing 4 to 6 inches and stop grazing 2 to 4 inches with bluegrass. Well, then you would just adjust your measurements and your graphing based on those desired pre- and post-grazing heights. So here we are with our data plotted, and in this case all of our points fall between the 12 and 4 inch pre- and post-grazing heights that we're trying to achieve. So then we transpose these data over onto this graph in order from tallest to shortest, and we see that basically these points fall within our desired range of regrowth. Now, since this is for approximately the next 2 weeks of planning, where we have our planned order of pasture grazing. We go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 5 to 6 to 4 and so on. And so now we can adapt our grazing based on the pasture height, and rather than going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we go 1, 2, 3, 5. So we're going to skip paddock 4 and we'll come back and we'll measure it in about 2 weeks. Now in this scenario, all of our paddock heights are below the 10-inch pre-grazing height that we desire. So we're basically going to be overgrazing our pastures if we start grazing any of these paddocks. When we transpose the data from our original graph over onto our grazing wedge, we see that none of these points fall within this trough of our 10 to 12 pre-grazing, 4 to 6 post-grazing. So we can pretty soon see that if we graze these, they're going to be overgrazed, and we need additional pasture in order to extend this. So one way to look at this would be basically we need to shift this line of points over so it falls into the trough. And there's a certain time period or number of paddocks that we would need additionally. So for example, we could incorporate some additional areas into our pasture system at that point to extend the regrowth period on these pastures. Or we could feed hay as some proportion of the diet of the animals, or take the animals off the pasture entirely in order to allow the pastures to regrow. And the amount of time that we might need could actually be predicted based on this graph. If we look at what it would take to shift this line over to here, it looks like it might be about 5 or 6 paddocks. And if we're in each paddock for about 2 to 3 days, that's about 10 to 15 days, maybe a week or two, additional time that we would need. So we can pretty soon make some measurements allow us to prevent overgrazing. Now in this third scenario, all of our pasture heights are above the 10-inch pre-grazing height that we desire. So when we transpose these dots over onto our grazing wedge, we see that the dots fall above the line of regrowth that we desire. So in order to make use of all this additional forage, we basically need to look at this the same way that we looked at the overgraze scenario. We need to shift this line of dots over so it fits into the line of regrowth. So that means we need to remove a certain number of paddocks. And it looks like we have about 8 paddocks that are basically too tall. And we need to either graze those immediately or hay them. And so if we do that and we replot the dots, we see basically maybe which ones should be hayed, which ones should be grazed, and that gives us our scenario for the next 2 weeks in order to manage all this extra grass. When you practice routinely measuring your pasture height and density using a grazing stick, and you construct a grazing wedge every 2 weeks, you're well on your way to developing the skills of a grazing manager. For more information about managed rotational grazing in Wisconsin, visit grassworks.org or swbadger.org for more information. Thanks for watching. I'm Robert Bauer, and good grazing to you.